Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing the new Martin Scorsese movie, Killers of the Flower Moon. So briefly, Killers of the Flower Moon centers around the murder of the Osage people in Oklahoma in the 1920s. Following the discovery of oil, the Osage people became among the wealthiest in the country. This new wealth attracted Americans from all over the country, many of them with the intent of generating some wealth of their own. Officially, the number of Osage people who were killed sits around 20. However, it's suspected that the death toll is actually hundreds. And of course, this is because of their ties to oil. Because of the heavy subject matter, this movie does feel very exhausting. And I don't mean that to say that it's a bad movie. However, if you want to wait for it on Apple TV+, that is more than understandable. Personally, I watched it in a cinema. I watched it in IMAX. And I was excited to see a Martin Scorsese movie like in the theater. So for me, I didn't feel the runtime as much. However, if you don't want to sit through a 3.5-hour movie and test your bladder, it should be coming out on streaming, I think, relatively soon. At the center of this crime drama is the relationship between Molly and Ernest. And for this movie to work, you really have to buy the chemistry between Leonardo DiCaprio and Lily Gladstone, which I did. And their courtship was actually my favorite part of the whole movie. And I think what makes this movie so terrifying is that I never doubted Ernest's love for Molly. And the fact that Ernest could lie, poison, nearly kill this woman that he loves, I felt really spoke to how these white communities promised integration, equality, when really all they wanted was like power and control. Starting with what I liked, I loved Leonardo DiCaprio's performance and Robert De Niro's. I felt that, watching them was a pleasure. And the contrast between them, I felt their characters complemented each other very well. Robert plays William Hale, and he's this like evil mastermind that just really is plotting the destruction of these people. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Ernest Burkhart, and he's kind of this dope, but he's dumb, but he's not like dumb enough to plead ignorance. And I really enjoyed watching him like silently rationalize all these horrible things that he was doing. Like every time he crossed the line and you watched him like silently struggle with it, like, there are times in the movie where you're like, oh, he's a really nice guy. And then as the movie goes on, you're like, I really can't stand this man. The standout performance was Lily Gladstone as Molly, and I actually think the movie would have been much better if the entire story was told from her perspective. And I actually think she's a strong enough actress that she could have actually held our attention. Like, I love seeing Leo, I love seeing De Niro, but Lily Gladstone was just as strong and even more interesting. Like, every time she left the screen, I wanted her to come back. I also really enjoyed the secondary characters. Like Martin Scorsese puts, like there are never any like supporting characters in his movies, right? Like everybody really plays their part. And I enjoyed the amount of time that the movie spends trying to immerse us in this like raggedy community. Like we really feel like we're there with them. And this is really important because minus these murders, there's all these horrible things going on in the background. So at face value, everybody seems integrated and assimilated. But when you kind of take a deeper look, you're like, oh my God, like this is a horror movie. So one of the things that really struck out at me is how integrated this community is, namely because a lot of white men seem to be marrying Osage women. And it's implied like, the movie doesn't really hold your hand and explain things explicitly. So I think for people who read the book, maybe they got more out of it. And that's another one of my criticisms. Like I wish they kind of spoon-fed us a little bit. So in the background, like a lot is happening. And one of them being that it's implied that a lot of Osage people are being killed off slowly. Throughout the film, we see how they struggle with alcoholism, depression, and other like serious ailments. And what's weird is that nobody's really doing anything about it. Like there seems to be like this understanding amongst the white community that they are agreeing to commit genocide, right? The police, the coroners, the accountants, like the white community in this town seems to be working together to make sure the Osage have as little power over what happens in this community and how much wealth they control. Although the land is technically owned by the Osage people, much of the wealth is clearly controlled by the white community. Like there's this whole discussion about guardianship that's not really elaborated on. Again, from what we can see, it seems like this community has developed different tactics and strategies to disable the Osage people from what is rightfully theirs. And again, at face value, everybody seems to be living in peace and harmony, but it's very clear that there's a hierarchy and things are not at all what they seem. So many comments and conversations that are just so casual and just so normal about how much less the Osage people are. You hear people commenting on the color of children's skin, being like, oh, that one is passing and that one is not. Basically, you get the sense that the white community in this town feel very much like superior to these people that they are very much depending on for their oil money. And as hard as the Osage people have tried, like that's one of the things I appreciate again about the movie, because you're kind of sitting in this community for so long, so you start to notice things. So even though it's not spoon-fed to you, like it is kind of made clear, like the Osage people kind of have gone out of their way to integrate with the white community, but all that's done is kind of accelerate their own erasure, right, of their culture, of their language, and more importantly, of their generational wealth, right? Like this oil that was discovered on their land gave them like access to all these opportunities, but it seems like slowly this wealth is being shifted and taken away from them. So right from the start of the movie, like, again, I was not familiar with the Osage murders. Like, this is not something that I knew, and I wish I had read the book beforehand. But the more time you spend in this town, the more clear it becomes why these murders are not being investigated, right? Like, a lot of the respect that the white community gives in this town is very performative. And meanwhile, we're learning about all these horrible things happening, right? It's clear that the politicians, like the police officers, they really have no interest in investigating the matter, like, whatsoever. And I think the other thing that's so terrifying about this community, like the longer you sit with them, is how all these monsters are hiding in plain sight. Like, it's very clear that this whole town is in on it. And it's very clear that without this oil money, they would turn this place into another Tulsa, right? Like, that was one of the parallels that the movie kept trying to draw. What happens in Tulsa does not happen in this community. It's just kind of happening in a different way, right? They're just being killed off much slower, and they're slowly being erased from this entire community. On top of immersing us in this community, the other relationship that I feel makes this movie work is the one between De Niro and DiCaprio. Like, they are so good, and they are so fascinating to watch, and Ernest in particular, because he's an outsider. He doesn't really know what's going on in this town. Like, he basically came home after the war, and it's made clear to us that this is not a violent man, right? He was a cook for most of it, right? He wasn't in the battlefield. And so watching him slowly become just like everybody else in this town, you know, by the end of it, the only thing that matters is his money, right? His wife, none of that really matters. And I found it interesting watching him rationalize his behavior, because it's very clear that he didn't really see the Osage people as people, right? In his mind, killing them didn't count, right? He was able to kind of get away with all these horrible things, you know, have knowledge of all these horrible things happening, but didn't do anything to stop it, contributed to it. And again, I'm watching Ernest thinking, like, maybe he'll change, you know, maybe like this love he has for his wife is the thing that might change him. But that's what makes him in a lot of ways, worse than his uncle, because you kind of see how deep like this racism goes, and you see how deep like the hatred for these people go. Like, again, the movie is not explicit. You know, you're not seeing people being massacred and their heads getting cut off. But in a way, that's what makes him more terrifying, right? And again, Ernest is a fascinating character because, you know, you want to sympathize for him, but he never really gives you any reason to. And the only person that he was really concerned with ultimately was his own safety and was securing his own bag. And again, you're watching everybody in this community do it, and it's kind of an open secret. And Ernest just jumps right in there. You know, he's actually despicable. Like, the way DiCaprio played him was like, I felt was really appropriate. Now, what I wish the movie had more of was the FBI. I understand that they didn't want to turn this into a procedural drama and they wanted to kind of keep it within the community. But I think one of the most frustrating things about this film is, like, we already know who did it. Like, that's the thing. There's no mystery. Like, we know who committed the crime. We know why they're doing it. Like, we know. So at this point, we're just watching how easily these people are doing it, but there's no mystery. So I think I would have loved to see how the FBI like connected the dots, how they were able to actually kind of come to that conclusion on their own, because they kind of get there pretty quickly, but we're not sure how. And again, the FBI show up quite late into the movie, and I felt like this is when the movie kind of, like, there was some energy, a much needed like shift in energy that I really appreciated. And there's this one Native American FBI agent, and again, this is why I wish the movie was told from a different perspective, like following Leo around, following De Niro around, like after a certain point, it's like we get it, they're terrible. So I think the perspective shift from the Native American community or the Osage community would have greatly helped, especially unpack a lot of things that will be missed on general audiences, because again, there's a lot of things happening in the background, and unless you're familiar, or unless you're able to kind of connect these dots, a lot of it will actually go over your head. So we see that one of the FBI agents is a Native American. And the FBI is actually known for recruiting people from different backgrounds, mostly because it makes it easier for them to spy on people. And so I would have loved to see his perspective, you know, like I'm sure he had some stories, like the idea that they were all equal and they were all like, they kind of presented the FBI as kind of a brotherhood. And the movie didn't really have time to unpack the kind of politics of it. But I would have loved to see his perspective. And, you know, he was in it for such a short time. He doesn't have a lot of lines, but he had such star power that I was like, can we just go inside his head for a second so we can see, you know, where, like, what his perspective on all this is and how he feels about working with all these white dudes. Like, that would have been great. I enjoyed Jesse Plemons. Like, again, he added a much needed energy boost to this film, and we needed that kind of shift in energy. I think, again, with the storyline with the FBI, it went by so quickly that it was hard to really appreciate how important the storyline was. So the FBI actually come to investigate this murder after the Osage people repeatedly went to Washington, and in the end, we hear paid a certain, like donated a certain amount of money. The FBI show up, and actually, their presence there was really important, and they really showed the need to have a federal agency and have people investigate crime that are outside of these corrupt local communities. Like, the FBI was a new organization. People didn't even know what it was. People didn't know what J. Edgar Hoover was. William Hale, Robert De Niro's character, he keeps making comments like, the federal government has no power here, you know, like, this is Osage County. So all these communities in America, like, although they're part of the same country, they kind of operate independently. And the FBI was kind of the beginning of the end of that. So they didn't really understand the magnitude or like the amount of power that this newly formed agency had. And again, that would have been something like we probably needed more time for. And so without the FBI, actually, there's no way these murders would be solved, because the movie spends a great deal of time basically telling us that this community, especially the white people in this community, are working very hard to make sure that the Osage people eventually disappear. So the FBI's presence was very much needed at that time. And so they were able to kind of crack down. They couldn't really corrupt them because, again, they're an outside agency. So that whole last bit with the investigation to the court proceedings, like, it went by too fast for my liking. And this honestly could have been like a 6-part series. Like, that's the other thing. Like, this movie, we needed like episodes. Like, there's just a lot of detail to unpack, you know, like half the season would be the community and the other half would be the FBI. And so this takes me to the end of the film. And overall, I do think this movie is well worth a watch. Now, whether or not you watch it in theaters or on Apple TV+, I'm gonna leave that up to you. I think the best part of this whole movie and why it kind of won me over was the ending. Like, I felt it was very appropriate, and you'll know what I mean when you see the film. But I personally didn't know anything about this story. And the ending was kind of a commentary on how we have been so desensitized, right? Like, true crime now exists for our entertainment. All these stories dug up, And a lot of it is being told not really to educate us, more again just to be like, but have you heard about this one? And have you heard about this one? Like the way a lot of true crime has been presented to audiences, again, it kind of allows us to kind of detach as if we were watching some sort of fictional series. And I do like that the end of this movie kind of made that commentary. And I felt the movie tried to balance, again, like taking on a very serious subject matter while at the same time entertaining its audiences and kind of having these moments of relief so that the 3.5 runtime doesn't feel so brutal. So I really appreciated the end. It was a great commentary. So I think my only recommendation, like if I could go back, I would definitely read the book. I would definitely try to get some context before going into this movie because I think it would make it a lot more enjoyable. And so overall, it's well worth seeing. Again, I warn you, it's like a heavy, like the subject matter is quite heavy. So if you don't really want to sit through that for 3.5 hours, I totally understand. And so if you've seen it, let me know what you think. And until next time.